You're listening to an Airwave Media podcast.
This episode is brought to you by PBS, home of Ken Burns. Ken Burns' films aren't just documentaries, they're national events, and his latest, The American Revolution, is the one you've been waiting for. When you think American Revolution, you probably picture tea crates in Boston Harbor, founders signing documents in Philadelphia, redcoats marching into battle. But Ken Burns, along with Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt, take us so much deeper. This was a revolution that was bloody, complicated, and unbelievably consequential. It's a story of people, some you know and many you don't, who risked everything to change the course of history. Their fight for independence lit a spark for freedom that still burns today. George Washington called it the cause of mankind, and John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "Posterity, you will never know what it cost us to preserve your freedom." With the American Revolution, Ken Burns and his team bring us a story that's vast, human, and deeply relevant, a story that belongs to all of us. Stream The American Revolution on the PBS app. I can't wait to give it a watch.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels on everything from lamps to ceiling fans, even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes, now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox, clean feels good.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another History of the Second World War interview. This time, I'm joined for the third time by Mark Stille to discuss his new book, Pearl Harbor, Japan's Greatest Disaster. Thank you once again for joining us, Mark.
Thanks for having me back, Wesley.
So you have written a book on Pearl Harbor. There are a lot of books about Pearl Harbor that have been written, that are probably being written right now, whole libraries. So with that in mind, what approach did you take to your book that helps it sort of be unique?
Well, it starts right on front in the introduction there. This book is written in large measure to address the many myths and misunderstandings about the battle. And they are right up front trying to catch the reader's attention, so he'll read further into the book. But we can go into a couple of those right now. There's just so much mythology about Pearl Harbor, so I tried to address in the book. Starting off with the notion that war could have been averted in the months before Pearl Harbor because the diplomats bungled negotiations. That's just not true. I think that negotiations was simply a smokescreen for Japan as they prepared for war. Obviously, we have to talk about Yamamoto and the notion that he was a great strategist. That myth is built on this Pearl Harbor attack, and as the book makes quite clear, the Pearl Harbor attack was not a great success. Therefore, he's not a great strategist. Also, the notion that he's a man of peace is silly. That's talked about in the book as well. And then the universal myth that the attack was not only brilliantly planned, but brilliantly executed. And that's probably the most of the book is dedicated to the actual military events of the battle. This is meant to be a military account of the battle. So there's a lot of analysis about the two attack waves. And in fact, the first attack wave underperformed, and the second attack wave was a total fiasco, and that's just forgotten about in most accounts of the battle. And there's a lot of other mythology too about the second attack that the Japanese supposedly considered. And if you saw the movie Tora Tora Tora, then you're familiar with the second attack. But that is also mythology. There's this Japanese submarine offensive that accompanied the attack that people don't even know about, except for the midget subs that went into Pearl Harbor. But there's a lot more than that involved. And that was also a total failure for the Japanese. And then there's this notion that the attack crippled the Pacific Fleet. That's prevalent. And that's if you read most books on the battle, go online and read about the battle, you will see that for sure. And as we'll talk about later, I'm sure that was also just not the case. And then the last thing, and this is covered in a whole chapter in the book, talks about the notion that Kimmel and Short, and they were the American commanders on Oahu, that they were scapegoated after the attack. So that's a lot to cover in a book, but those are the main themes in the book.
There's also a lot to cover in an interview here, but let's start with sort of something you touch on throughout the book, but is often the case with famous events like the attack on Pearl Harbor. It's kind of easy to assume that attacking Pearl Harbor was always the Japanese plan, and that maybe there were no other options on how to start a war with the United States. But that does not appear to be the case.
That's certainly the case. And of course, people kind of miss that because after a long debate and a long process, the attack was approved. And again, that ties back to Yamamoto because he is the only guy in the Japanese High Command who wanted to do this. And against universal or almost universal opposition, he got the attack approved. But yes, there were other options, and they were probably better for the Japanese. And especially with 2020 hindsight, now that we know that the attack backfired for the Japanese, they had other options. The best one would have been to avoid war with the U.S., which they were not inclined to do. I mean, but they could have been much more strategically subtle and attacked the Dutch and the British and not attack the U.S. Now, there are a lot of problems with that, and it would have driven the War College trained strategists in the Imperial Navy crazy because it would have left the Philippines intact and the U.S. forces there on their flank. So, and in the long run, of course, the U.S. would have gotten involved in the war. But in the short run, they could have not attacked the U.S. at the onset. But then perhaps a better strategy would have been to be against the U.S. passive strategically and let the U.S. Navy come to them. And that's what they've been planning for 20 years before the Pearl Harbor attack is this all-out great battle, as they called it, somewhere in the Central Pacific, which and early in the war would have perhaps, maybe most likely, turned out favorably for the Japanese. So they had a lot of options other than to poke the U.S. in the eye and attack Pearl Harbor.
And that becomes even sort of more interesting to talk about in hindsight, given how important it seemed to the Americans entering the war and kind of public support for the war that American soil was actually attacked. I doubt you see anything like that if it's just the British and the Dutch territories being attacked in the Southeast Pacific.
Right. Can you imagine? And even Roosevelt admitted this, that he could not take the U.S. into war to defend a Dutch colony. That wasn't going to happen. But the Japanese thought that the U.S. and the British and the Dutch were all linked strategically. So they didn't see any difference there between attacking one or all of those.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned earlier, and I was going to ask about, is you dedicate an entire chapter to the topic that usually just gets a brief mention, which is the actions of Japanese submarines, sort of in relation to the attack on Pearl Harbor. So, what were the Japanese trying to accomplish with those submarines? And then, why were the results so disappointing?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right. People don't even know about that because it is utter failure. There's really nothing to say about it, except the spectacular part of this submarine offensive, which was these 5 midget subs. And they go into the harbor in the hours before the attack. And here's another example of bad planning on the Japanese and bad planning on the part of Yamamoto, because he personally approved the entry of these subs into the channel many hours before the attack. So the aviators said, no, you don't want to do this because it has the potential of sacrificing surprise for the entire attack. And of course it did, because one of these midget subs was detected over 4 hours before the attack began. So not a good idea to potentially jeopardize surprise for the entire attack, the small payoff these midget subs could have provided. So midget sub part was a failure. But more than that, there were every modern submarine in the Imperial Navy, or the most modern submarines in the Imperial Navy, were dedicated to this offensive in and around Hawaiian waters. And the thinking was that as the U.S. Navy left Pearl Harbor under attack, they'd have plenty of opportunities to pick off these ships. And the Japanese saw this as a backup plan to the air attack, which may or may not have gone well based on surprise. But in the event, because of bad doctrine, and this is both on the part of Japanese subs and U.S. subs at the time, so it just wasn't the Japanese, but these submarine commanders were trained to prize concealment over being aggressive. So the bottom line here is all these subs in the next 2 or 3 weeks, they only account for 5 merchant ships, and they don't even ever attack an American naval ship during this whole time. So the whole thing is an utter failure.
It's interesting. You mentioned that the Americans had similar problems. I feel like in many cases, that early period in the Pacific War for submarines was a time of serious challenges, whether they were technical challenges or doctrine challenges of trying to get the most out of the submarines. And it doesn't necessarily surprise me that the Japanese submarines did not do amazing things around Hawaii.
Yeah, not a surprise at all. And the Americans did equally as poor when they had a lot of subs in the Philippines and in the Dutch East Indies. They also performed quite poorly. But the Japanese submarines, though, labored under this bad doctrine for the entire war. And the American subs learned quickly, and they applied new technology, new tactics, new commanders, and they were a real force later on in the war.
Looking at the period directly before the attack, one of the topics for discussion there is certainly the role of military intelligence on both sides of the Pearl Harbor operation. And it seems to me, like, kind of thinking about the entire scope of the Pacific War and how things would go, the performance of the Japanese and American military intelligence units are in some ways swapped during this operation. I think the general statement would be that Japanese intelligence did quite poorly throughout the Pacific, and the American intelligence got better, certainly throughout the Pacific War. But here at the beginning, it feels like the Japanese did pretty well, and the Americans totally, botched it.
That is totally correct. So here, probably for the only time in the whole war, the Japanese win the intelligence war and the run up to Pearl Harbor. So as is pointed out in the book, the Japanese Navy pretty much disdained intelligence, and they did not use it well. They let operations drive intelligence. They didn't let any intel get in the way of a good plan or a bad plan in most cases. Instead of the Americans who at least after Pearl Harbor let intelligence drive operations. So yeah, the American naval intelligence did not perform very well. So there are reasons for this. It's true to say that the Americans were reading Japanese codes at this time, but these were diplomatic codes. So there's no reference in there to any Japanese intention to attack Pearl Harbor. There's no reference in these decoded messages to any specific Japanese move in the Pacific. So the plan was not in these diplomatic codes. And at this time, the Americans weren't able to crack the Japanese Navy operational code. Now, this changed obviously in the weeks and months after Pearl Harbor, but at this point, there was no insight into Japanese operational thinking. So, given that the Americans had no insight into Japanese intentions, they should have been looking at Japanese capabilities, but they failed to do this. Now, obviously, if they would have, thought for more than 30 seconds, they would have realized that the Japanese had 6 fleet aircraft carriers, so therefore there's the real potential to attack Pearl Harbor should the Japanese want to do so. But the Americans didn't do it either. So the staff on Oahu and the intel people there were guilty of groupthink. None of them thought that this attack was likely, and they also were guilty of mirror imaging because they gave the Japanese credit for a lot more rationality than they were showing at the time. So surely the Japanese would not attack a nation many times stronger than themselves. They didn't realize that the Japanese at this point were facing what they thought was an existential threat. So, against the American economic blockade. So, given that, all bets were off and that anything was possible. But this was totally missed by the Americans. And yes, naval intelligence was trying to track the principal units in the Imperial fleet, like their aircraft carriers, for example, but they weren't able to do this either. So, as you mentioned, the Japanese won the intel war before the battle. They had a very simple but effective radio deception plan to hide the movements of their aircraft carriers. And most importantly, they had these operatives on Oahu that were given free run of the island. So, and it gave tremendous insights into the American deployments on the island. So, tactically, that information was utterly important for the operation as it was planned out by the Japanese.
Looking at the operation itself, very, very famous. But you mentioned that even the first wave, the quite successful in some ways, but didn't live up to expectations. So, what were those expectations?
Yeah, that's the centerpiece of the book because this is meant to be a military account of the battle. So there's a lot of setup there, looking at the Japanese plan and the Japanese forces and the American defenses. But the heart of the book covers these two attack waves. So the first attack wave was supposed to be the big one in the eyes of the Japanese because that's when surprise would be in effect. So Japanese assumed surprise, and they in fact got surprise. So that's when they could employ these vulnerable torpedo bombers and these slow horizontal attack planes, which were armed with these heavy bombs to attack battleships. So the Japanese were going to focus this attack, at least the first wave of the attack, on carriers and battleships. And they had 90 aircraft, 40 armored torpedoes, and 50 with these big bombs to attack the battleships and torpedoes. But of note, a lot of other aircraft were targeted on American airfields. And also of note, throughout the day, the Japanese had more sorties devoted against American airfields than against American naval targets. So the first wave, as you said, did a lot of damage. And we're all familiar with that. We've seen pictures of smoking battleships on Battleship Row because they did do a lot of damage. Now, Japanese thought it was going to be worse than it was, at least worse for the Americans. So they have these 40 torpedo bombers. They expect 27 hits out of the 40, but the actual number was only 19 hits. And this is still going to cause a lot of damage, but of the 19, 12 hits were scored on only 2 targets. And again, that's because of bad planning on the part of the Japanese. So the Japanese torpedo attack, for the most part, the ones targeted on the battleships, came in from one area down the southeast lock, and right in front of them, they saw 2 battleships. And this is Oklahoma, West Virginia. So most of the pilots took this target. So they over-concentrated on these 2 ships. Actually, they did hit 4 battleships with torpedoes, but most torpedoes went on these 2 battleships alone. So that underachieved the Japanese. Then the level bombers come in next after the torpedo bombers, and there were 49 bombs dropped. The Japanese thought they were going to get maybe a 20% to a 33% accuracy rate. They did get 20%, so 10 bombs hit out of 49. That's not bad. But of the 10 bombs that hit, only 6 of them exploded properly. So due to technical problems, because these bombs were converted battleships, so due to technical problems, the attack underachieved once again. But one of these bombers, though, did hit Arizona. So one of the 4 bombs and functions hits Arizona. Well, they hit her twice, actually. One hit in the Ford magazine. We all know what happened to Arizona at Pearl Harbor. The ship was destroyed with a very, very high loss of life. So from that standpoint, the attack did about as well as they had hoped. But if we dissect the second attack wave, that's where the problems really came in. So second attack wave contained all the elite dive bomber crews from the most experienced carriers in the Imperial Navy. So 81 dive bombers were allocated, but only 78 actually took off. So you have 78 dive bombers with these elite crews trying to hit stationary targets in the harbor. So this should have been a big success story for the Japanese. But the results were far from that. And this is totally lost in all accounts of the battle. And that's because of several reasons. Again, not well known in most accounts of the battle, or are not well developed. When these dive bombers show up, it's the second wave now. The Americans are fully alert, so they're firing back. And you can see on photos of the event the heavy anti-aircraft barrage the Americans are putting up at the time. You also see all the smoke in the harbor from the first attack wave. There's a lot of smoke from Battleship Row. And also, you can see the low-hanging clouds over the harbor. So this is not a good situation for these dive bomber pilots. They can't execute their typical dive bomber profile which is like 11,000 feet in a steep dive. You can't dive through clouds if you can't see a target. So they have a very unfavorable condition there, and they don't do well. The Japanese expect well, their pre-attack plan for the dive bombers was to hit carriers and then cruisers, but there were no carriers present on the morning of the attack. So once again, bad planning. When they show up, there's really not a firm backup plan for what to do if the carriers aren't there. Now there is this attack priority list, which apparently right before the attack was launched, the pilots were told to ignore. So it becomes a free for all. It's a chaotic mess, and you're diving through clouds into anti-aircraft fire. And so instead of having a firm backup plan, they throw this into the laps of individual pilots or maybe section leaders of 3 pilots, and the attack is a fiasco. So 78 dive bombers go in. The Japanese claim 49 hits. That's a total fabrication, probably just to save face of the aviators involved. But they actually only they gained 16 hits out of 78 dive bombers against stationary targets. So that shows you how bad the conditions were. It also shows you what a fiasco the attack was. And these hits are on targets they were told not to hit. So most of the pilots hit battleships. Not a good idea because these dive bombers are carrying pretty small bombs, which don't even have the power to penetrate battleship armor. So you can't hurt a battleship. You can cause some topside damage. You're not going to inflict serious damage on it. But nevertheless, battleship being a very lucrative target, most of the pilots hit these, and they attack some destroyers and auxiliaries, not even on their target list, really. So the attack is a total fiasco and a big disappointment for the Japanese.
It's interesting that in 2 of those cases, it feels like it's kind of a command and control issue at a tactical level, right? With the too many torpedoes on one ship, because the Americans, sure, if you hit it with 2, you might as hitting it with 20 doesn't necessarily change the outcome. But on the Japanese side, that's really important because of how it kind of concentrates the damage and doesn't spread it out as they want it to. And then also with the dive bombers, right? Not having a plan, not following a plan to keep things structured and hitting the most high priority targets. Like, those are just simple mistakes that, it sounds like it really robbed the attack of some of its impact.
Yeah, it was just not well conducted at all. And there were 4 carrier groups with dive bombers involved in the dive bomber attack. And actually, one of the carrier groups did exert some command control. So the leader of the Kaga dive bombers, at this point, Battleship Nevada is trying to make her way out of the harbor. And perhaps people have seen photographs of her sailing majestically down Battleship Road, trying to get out of the harbor. And when the Japanese saw this, and that's when the Kaga crew shows up, when the Japanese saw this, they thought they could bottle up the fleet they sank in the channel, which is another myth because she wasn't long enough to block the channel. But nevertheless, the Japanese do this. But we talked about these small bombs against battleship armor, and it just wasn't the best way to use their bombs. So what they should have done, what they had planned to do, was to hit cruisers, which were, as it turned out, in the carrier war to be, these were valuable ships, as carrier escorts in particular. So they should have hit them. There were several targets in the harbor area, and they ignored them for the most part.
This episode is brought to you by PBS, home of Ken Burns. Ken Burns' films aren't just documentaries, they're national events. And his latest, The American Revolution, is the one you've been waiting for. When you think American Revolution, you probably picture tea crates in Boston Harbor, founders signing documents in Philadelphia, redcoats marching into battle. But Ken Burns, along with Sarah Botstein and David Schmidt, take us so much deeper. This was a revolution that was bloody, complicated, and unbelievably consequential. It's a story of people, some you know and many you don't, who risked everything to change the course of history. Their fight for independence lit a spark for freedom that still burns today. George Washington called it the cause of mankind, and John Adams wrote to his wife Abigail, "Posterity, you will never know what it cost us to preserve your freedom." With the American Revolution, Ken Burns and his team Bring us a story that's vast, human, and deeply relevant. A story that belongs to all of us. Stream The American Revolution on the PBS app. I can't wait to give it a watch.
Hi, I'm here to pick up my son Milo.
There's no Milo here.
Who picked up my son from school?
Streaming only on Peacock.
I'm gonna need the name of everyone that could have a connection.
You don't understand. It was just the five of us.
So this was all planned.
What are you gonna do?
I will do whatever it takes to get my son back.
I honestly didn't see this coming. These nice people killing each other.
All Her Fault, a new series streaming now, only on Peacock.
On the American side, you mentioned early on that sort of after Pearl Harbor happens, after the news kind of spreads around, and in the immediate aftermath, some of the commanders in Hawaii are, relieved of their command for various reasons. So could you talk about those men and, if you feel like it was justified, sort of what happened to them? The word scapegoat gets thrown around a lot as if they did nothing wrong. So how do you sort of evaluate that?
Yeah, that gets a whole chapter in the book because it's kind of a big deal, and it's also one of the pillars there of the revisionist school, looking at the attack, that Kimmel and Short were scapegoated. And Kimmel and Short were left hanging because Washington, quote unquote, didn't tell them everything. I mean, we already talked about the intelligence. Washington didn't have any intelligence that Pearl Harbor was under direct threat. But nevertheless, I mean, they are culpable for this attack. I think my stance on that is pretty clear once you read the book. But things didn't go well at Pearl Harbor, obviously. So both officers are relieved on 17 December. Right after the attack, the Americans try to figure out what went wrong, because something obviously went very wrong. So, in fact, there are 10 investigations between 1941 and 1995. So the first one is the so-called Roberts Commission investigation, and they come down hard on Kimmel and Short. They find them both culpable for misjudgment, and they also went as far as to say that they were guilty of dereliction of duty. But they also, and this part was perhaps what is debatable, they kind of whitewashed Washington's responsibility for this bad event. Even in 1995, the last investigation was the Dorn report, which was done at the behest of Kimmel's family to look into how if Kimmel was treated fairly or not. And even in 1995, a whole new generation of American policymakers, they come down on the side that Kimmel and Short were culpable, but they also made the common sense judgment too that responsibility should be more broadly shared. So Washington was at fault for some degree, to some degree. It wasn't because they didn't share all intelligence, though in fact they did not share all intelligence, but this was intelligence from the diplomatic codes that Washington had looked at and decided that that they couldn't connect the dots to a Pearl Harbor attack. So it's unlikely that if the guys on Oahu would have seen this, that they would have seen that link. Very unlikely. So that's kind of a red herring. But Washington sent out a 27 November so-called war warning message to the commanders on Pearl Harbor, which to me is pretty focused. The first line says, "This message is meant to be a war warning." So if I got that, I think I would take it seriously and prepare for war. That wasn't what happened, though. Perhaps that message could have been more focused. But what Washington could have done for sure is to exercise proper oversight. So if they didn't like what the commanders on Oahu did after they got the war warning message, they could have told Kimmel and Short to do something different or something more, and they failed to do that. So Kimmel, his performance was not good during these days before the attack. He totally failed to conceive of even the possibility of an air attack. Again, that's lack of imagination that a lot of people said that he was guilty of in general. Here's a case in point. He had a large force of patrol aircraft. There were 67 long-range patrol aircraft. How many of these were searching for possible attack force approaching Pearl Harbor on the morning of the attack? Well, the answer is 0. Therefore, there's a 0% chance they're going to find this Japanese fleet before it launches its attack. So Kimmel does not take, there were several warnings, and one of them was this 27th November war warning. There were others as well, but he never does increase the readiness of the fleet. Make it worse, he has most of the fleet in harbor on the same day. So here you have tensions ramping up with the Japanese. Hostilities are imminent, but he has all the fleet in one place, in harbor, where it's at its most vulnerable. And even on the morning of the attack, there were several warnings the attack was coming. One we talked about is the midget subs, and there was a radar contact on scout planes south of Pearl Harbor, and also the Pearl Harbor attack force. But the command and control system that Kimmel had in place was unable to respond to that. Then if you look at Short, General Short, he's the commander of the Army forces on Oahu. He put in perhaps an even worse performance. Again, he totally failed to conceive of the possibility of an air attack. When he got the 27 November message, which was different than the one Kimmel got, so there's another problem. Washington could be held responsible for that. He actually reduces the readiness of his forces to repel an air attack, and he enhances his anti-sabotage defenses. So therefore, there's not a single fighter that's fully fueled, fully armed, ready to go in the morning of 7 December. And all the aircraft are lined up in rows, making easy targets for the Japanese. There's no anti-aircraft guns manned on the island. And this information center, which should have been the heart of an air defense network, that was unready and virtually unmanned on the morning of the attack. So the commanders on the ground on Pearl Harbor have final responsibility for what transpired on the morning of 7 December.
It's a lot of those things that you mentioned I find interesting because it's not like they were being asked to do dangerous or things that would risk equipment or whatever. So have some people watching radars, have some scout planes up doing some scouting, relatively straightforward, easy and obvious things that could have really changed the course of the day.
Yeah, it's not fair to say that Kimmel didn't do anything because he didn't see that Pearl Harbor was a target, but he did see that perhaps other American islands might be under threat. So he did reinforce Wake. He did reinforce Midway because he thought perhaps they were more vulnerable than Pearl Harbor. So he did do that. But what he was thinking of, though, he was thinking in terms of the offensive. The fleet was an offensive tool in his mind. He had grandiose plans to use it in the Central Pacific. So actually, the Wake reinforcement, Midway reinforcement were part of his preparation for this offensive, more so than preparing for an attack by the Japanese. All the way around, Kimmel was just dead wrong in his assessments.
You mentioned kind of looking towards an offensive in the Pacific, but then of course the events at Pearl Harbor, the results that the Japanese did achieve really change American plans, sort of because they don't have the ships that they thought they would have. But at the same time, you mentioned this in the book, is that when you look at the results of the attack, yes, in the immediate aftermath, it causes some of these issues for the American fleet, but it kind of seems for the Japanese like it was in some ways counterproductive on a strategic level for the course of the war. How do we evaluate the strategic impact of the attack on Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective, and how do we rate it in terms of positive and negative outcomes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's a big part of the book because, as the subtitle indicates, I don't think this attack did the Japanese any favors. So you need to look at you need to evaluate what the attack gained for them. And you mentioned that the fleet didn't have much to work with, but that's also a large degree of mythology there because yes, most of the fleet was caught in harbor on 7 December, but not the entire fleet. There were 100 ships present in the harbor on that morning. And luckily for the Americans, none of the 3 carriers of the fleet were in Pearl Harbor on that morning, but 8 of the 9 battleships were. So of these 100 ships, there were 18 that were sunk or damaged. Of these, all but 3 came back. But as we talked about there in this first wave attack, the battleships were the focus of the Japanese attack, and they took most of the hits. So Japanese did do a lot of damage there. 8 battleships were present, 4 were sunk, 1 was running around to keep from sinking, and 3 more were lightly damaged. So had this been a battleship war in the days and weeks and years to follow, this would have been maybe a crippling loss. But the Japanese just showed on day 1 it wasn't going to be a battleship war; it's going to be a carrier war. But yet they focused on battleships. And to make it even more absurd, so I can bang on Yamamoto some more, his plan was to sink battleships because he saw this as a means to cripple American morale, which was a totally unfounded assessment. But to do so, he was willing to sacrifice part of his carrier fleet. And the Japanese expected to lose about a third of their carrier force. So 2 carriers are going to be sunk to sink what Yamamoto hoped to be 4 battleships. So you're going to lose carriers to sink battleships. So again, does not reflect well on Yamamoto. But getting back to the Pacific Fleet, so they take these hits. The battle line is badly battered. To be fair, Japanese did accomplish that. Now, in actuality, though, it was quickly rebuilt. So by June, the Americans had 7 battleships left, and these were pretty capable battleships in terms of battleships of the period. But so not useful were they that when Nimitz put together his plan for Midway, he had no role for the battleships. So anyhow, the Pacific Fleet, which was supposedly crippled by the attack, by February, they're on the offensive, the bunch of carrier raids that began on 1 February. And then in May, they stopped the Japanese cold at the Battle of Coral Sea. And then in June, at Midway, as we're probably familiar with, the Americans sank 4 to 6 Pearl Harbor carriers. So the fleet was not crippled at Pearl Harbor. That's pretty obvious. But your question, though, was more about the strategic impact. And there's a lot to talk about there as well, because strategically, Yamamoto had 2 goals, and that was to cripple the fleet. We just talked about that. That didn't happen. And then he had this incredibly naive assumption that was never examined by anybody else in the Japanese hierarchy, the Japanese intelligence establishment. But he had this assessment that if he could sink 4 battleships, he could crush American morale. Here's a guy who lived in America twice, who had this great insight into the American psyche, and he thought that he could sink battleships and crush American morale and make us more willing to accept some kind of negotiated peace. So that didn't happen either, obviously. But what did happen is that it gave us backbone. So going into the war, the Japanese had a very loose idea how to win this war. If they had a plan for victory, it boiled down to the notion that they were going to take what they had to take in Southeast Asia and seize the resources for a long war so they could withstand a long war. And at some point, the Americans would get tired of battering their head against the Japanese defenses. And at that point, there would be some kind of negotiated peace. Well, what's the best way to undermine that prospect of negotiated peace? Well, how about a surprise attack on day 1 of the war, an unprovoked surprise attack, a treacherous surprise attack in the eyes of the American, where you cause heavy loss of American life and you're attacking American sovereign territory. So idiotic on the part of the Japanese because it undermines their only road to victory.
Yeah, it's interesting that you talk about the battleships and the role that they played or couldn't play or whatever, because when you do look at those early Pacific actions after Pearl Harbor, the battleships have no role on either side. Neither of them are really out there using battleships in any kind of offensive role. I think throughout the war, the American battleships spend more time lobbing shells at beaches than they do at other ships. So yeah, I've even seen theories out there from time to time around like actually damaging some of those battleships helped the Americans because it forced the Navy to sort of think about and plan other types of naval operations.
Yeah, you might say that, but the problem with the battleships was their simple lack of speed. So the Americans had been exploring carrier strike groups before Pearl Harbor, and there was no role for a 21 knot battleship in a 30 knot plus carrier strike force. So even if they hadn't been touched, there really was no effective way to use them. And the Japanese used battleships to a small degree because they had 4 battleships that were actually converted World War I battle cruisers, so they were fast. So, in fact, the Pearl Harbor attack force had 2 of these with it. So the Japanese were able to use these fast battleships early in the war. And then when the Americans got their fast battleships, the ones that were built in the naval expansion program right before Pearl Harbor and after Pearl Harbor, once those come into line, they were used heavily during the war. But the old ones at Pearl Harbor had no rule, you're right. But eventually, starting in the Aleutian campaign, I think, so we're talking late 1943, eventually they become very useful in amphibious operations, providing fire support.
You kind of opened our discussion here talking about how this book attempts to address a lot of the myths involved with the operation. Thinking about your time sort of writing this book, right? Is there anything that has changed your mind, or have your thoughts evolved on any of these topics from where you started the book to where you are now, having it published?
That's a pretty good question. And when I think about it, uh, really nothing comes to mind. I mean, my inspiration for the book was a very solid book written by my college professor, a guy named Gordon Prang. So he wrote this book, At Dawn We Slept. And it's a very good book. And it's a very good book, in particular from the Japanese side, because Gordon Prang knew a lot of these guys. He talked to them after the war. He became their friend. I found the Japanese planning process just very uh, compelling to understand what they were thinking at the time. So, but I knew, looking at the attack and reading the accounts of the battle, about the brilliant success that it was, because it was so brilliantly executed, I knew that was just not true. So that was the intent behind the book. I think I laid out the reasons why these myths are what are incorrect. So from that standpoint, I think I don't think I have any new revelations here during the writing process.
Okay, well, thank you for coming to the podcast today to talk to us about your book. And everybody can pick it up. That's Pearl Harbor, Japan's Greatest Disaster, which is out now.
Yep, it's out now. Enjoy the read if you get it. Thanks for having me back, Wesley.